Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv, still insisting on singing a thing when I have no business singing into a microphone. It is, of course, that time again. It is Pride Month, the month I use to just share as many stories from the ancient world that feature queer or can be read as queer characters, except for the fact that I've basically covered them all. And so today, because honestly, I mean, already, a bunch of this month's episode have just been finishing up the Ion, and so I just was not willing to not release episodes that feature queer characters because I just love them. I love that they exist, and I love the way that I have told the stories in the past. So today and next week, I am bringing you my own new, fun, curated list, but not a list, fun, curated, compilation of past episodes I have done featuring characters that fit into, what we now call LGBTQIA. These are characters who have gender fluidity in a way that is just so relatable today and which is just so important. These are trans characters or characters who are transformed into another gender by the gods as kind of gifts often. These are characters who have a hell of a lot of boyfriends. And of course there is, a whole one example of women who loved other women in the ancient world. But last year I featured moments from my Sappho episodes. So I didn't include her this time, but you can always go back and listen to the, I think, 3 episodes I have done, 2 conversations and 1 narrative about Sappho, the poetess. I hate saying, a weirdly gendered word, but it just is so nice because there's like one woman whose work survives from the ancient world and she was a damn fine poet. So, as always, too, you can find linked in the episode's description a link to a Spotify playlist which features all the many episodes I have done for the Pride months over the years. There you can find the full-length episodes of everything that I am sharing today and next week. But for now, I pulled just like some fun moments that I found. I, so rarely listen back to my own work, but I went and pulled up a list of all of the episodes that I've done, and I went to some of the ones that I remember being ones that I'm really proud of, or the times that I've kind of reimagined these characters and their lovers, or, things like that. So I have pulled out some favorites from last year, and I think the year before, some more recent versions, where I really dive into the details and really drill it in. And, some other, just some wild stuff. So today's episode features Dionysus, of course, the god who is inarguably gender fluid, who I am discussing on the conversation episode this week because I may have kind of exhausted the actual mythological stories that survive featuring characters that fit into the Pride Month series. But I can always have more conversations, thankfully. So I will always be trying to bring those to you all. And this month we have 3, but that's all to say. Today's episode features moments from Dionysus, some of my favorite, including the conversation I did years ago now with Emma Pauley, a classicist, dramaturge, translator who had written or translated rather a non-binary reading of Bacchae. So I went back to my conversation with Emma and pulled out some fascinating moments from their chat and looked particularly these moments where we can read this kind of gender fluidity, both really positive and really not. And just, it was such a fun moment for me to revisit because it has been so long since I've listened because I can't listen to myself back. So I wanted to share that moment with you. And then that fed directly into one of my favorite 2-part episodes I did 2 years ago for Pride, I think. And that is the episode on Dionysus and Empellis from the Dionysiaca. It is an absolutely wild story. The Dionysiaca is in itself wild. What a fun time. I didn't pull out the naked wrestling part. I believe that's what it is. I remember that is like a favorite of people. So I didn't share that. It's just the beginning and sort of a conversation I had with myself about why these stories are really important. So we're going to listen to that. But if you want to listen to the whole of the Impellus episode, because it is wild, there is a 2-part series again in the Spotify playlist. And then it is followed up with a part of the conversation I had last year with returning guest Yentl Love. Yentl is so lovely, and we had such a fun chat talking about queer theory and queer readings of the ancient world. But this part that I selected is Yentl and I discussing these stories of what can be very reasonably and very righteously read as trans characters in the ancient world. So this is kind of our trans, non-binary, gender fluidity episode. Next week, we're looking at all the many boyfriends of all the many men. So sit back and enjoy. This is episode 264. Gender has always been fluid. Just ask Dionysus. Before we dive into our beloved god of wine, he of so many names, I do want to take a minute to talk a bit about the terms that we use and the understanding of sexual attraction and relationship when it comes to the ancient Greeks. See, an interesting thing you learn when you're around more academic world of Greek history and mythology is a tendency towards caveats when it comes to sexuality in the ancient world. I get it. I think that's important. It's interesting. I also don't want to do a lot of it on this show. Except for after I explain. So if you're talking historicity and a broad and nuanced understanding of the mythology, you do have to come to terms with the fact that while many of these stories might seem somewhat progressive to us, they weren't necessarily as progressive as we want them to be, or at times progressive at all. Yes, there are stories of same-sex relationships in Greek mythology and history, but that doesn't mean that anyone was necessarily out there identifying as gay or even an equivalent. This is both because of societal expectations and because, well, they would have had no idea what the fuck we're talking about. The people of ancient Greece wouldn't know gay or straight or bi or anything. They would simply know people who might have gone against the societal expectations and norms when it comes to who they were with or how they identified. And often those people would have probably paid a price for that part of their lives. And then there's the pederasty, the ancient Greek concept of relationships between older men and boys that were, yes, often sexual. I'm not going to go there because it's not helpful, it is dark, and just all around not a place I want to go. But in case you haven't heard the word before, that's it. It was a big part of a lot of that world, and it's not a good or honest example of gay relationships because it was based in an inherent power dynamic between mature men and young men or boys that I would say completely negates anything that might suggest a pro-homosexual or generally more progressive society. But I tell you all of this not to blow up anyone's dreams of a history of LGBTQIA people, because I'm not, and as always, much of this month is going to be devoted to characters who would probably identify within that realm if they had those words. Still, I do think it's interesting and important to examine the intricacies of this and the historical dynamics at play. And most of that applies primarily to historical characters rather than mythological. They still wouldn't have had the words, but they also had more freedoms because they weren't real. Let's be honest though, I'm telling you all of these interesting historical details because I'm a nerd and I find the nuance and intricacies of history and mythology fucking fascinating. And you're listening to me, so you probably do too, or at least you enjoy the sound of my voice enough to deal with it. Still, to be very clear, there were absolutely gay people in the ancient world, and there were absolutely trans people and everyone else. They just wouldn't call themselves either, and they wouldn't have been able to live freely as themselves. They didn't have names for how they felt or identified. But, fortunately, we have those names now, and it is very important, especially when it comes to trans people, to note that there absolutely were people of diverse genders in the ancient world, and the ancient Greeks, at least, absolutely found ways to understand the issues those people had when it comes to their own body and physical anatomy. And now I'm rambling a bit, but ultimately my intention here is to make the case for how we examine ancient people and point out the issues a lot of professionally smart people have with using modern terms to define ancient and mythological people, and also to say, I'm still going to use those more finite modern terms where appropriate, because I think it's important in a podcast like mine that is commercial and broad and isn't academic to give people of today someone in the ancient world and mythology to look at and see themselves. Honestly, that can only be beneficial to everyone, especially those that fall into the wide spectrum of LGBTQIA.
We are being invited to see these women and people in the way that Pentheus sees them, which is that they are up on Mount Kithaeron for the purpose of doing the nasty.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really interesting that every single time Pentheus says that in the play, someone else, sometimes, I think once or twice it's Tiresias, once or twice it's one of the messengers, sometimes it's Dionysus, somebody will refute him. Somebody will say, no, sir, I didn't see that. No, sir, that's not what's going on. Tiresias says, if a woman wants to be chaste, she'll be chaste. Aphrodite won't have these women if they don't want her. Dionysus won't lead the women to Aphrodite if they don't want to be led. There's this affirmation of the sexual autonomy of the chorus, which does kind of work against this rock star and his groupies staging that happens so often that these women are following Dionysus out of a sense of sexual attraction. And it also folds in how Dionysus himself is very powerfully sexualized on stage a lot of the time, and how that kind of folds in this like queer othering. Because the way that they present themselves, in the text, it's described, they're pretty clear about what they look like and what they're wearing. And they, when Dionysus talks about himself, he says, I am wearing the costume of a Maenad. I am wearing the fawn skin. I am wearing I am holding the thyrsus. I am wearing clothing that would be associated with a woman. And when other people talk, they say, this person has long hair. This person has pale skin. This person has flushed cheeks. And the way that is interpreted is as something that was deliberately designed to be sexually attractive. And deliberately designed to be sexually attractive in a kind of deceitful and entrapping way, which has some very not fun resonances with the way that modern, particularly trans and non-binary people are sometimes viewed, in that their choices about their sartorial and physical presentation are done as a trap, or as a means of deceit, or as a means of attraction, as opposed to somebody wearing something or somebody choosing to look a certain way because it makes them feel like them.
Which is like, that feels like it should always be the most obvious.
And yet
we live in this world. So I say that knowing full well that that's wrong. But this is so interesting to hear all of this, because I think it's a good thing and a bad thing. Certainly, I personally have felt like it's a very bad thing that I don't think I have ever seen a staging of a Greek play. I don't think that they've ever been available to me in any kind of accessible way. And so certainly I should be, I could be searching some for in video and everything, but I love watching theater in person. But I've seen so much Shakespeare because that's the world we live in. And so it's really interesting to me to hear all of this because I have only read Bacchae. I have read it multiple times and in multiple translations, but I have only read it. And so it is such an interesting difference to hear how it is presented, because I don't get the like sexualization of the maenads in the reading of it. And then maybe it's also because I know that what the maenads would have looked like, and that like sure there is like an aspect where we would use the word orgy at times, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are these like hypersexualized beings all of the time.
Yeah.
And so I think that it is, that's just so interesting to hear. And that it is such a, Dionysus in this play is so obviously meant to be like fluid in many ways, in whatever intention was meant in terms of their gender. But like it is obvious, like you're saying, of the way that they're dressed. And that's interesting too, because it's not as if, like, one thing that I like to remind my listeners is that we don't have stage directions or costuming directions. We don't have anything like that. No. So the fact that we know exactly how he's dressed is because he says it explicitly. So it's also a very specific, like, rare thing that we know how Dionysus would have been dressed. And I think that should be like a, almost a nudge to the productions of it to say, like, you actually for once have an idea of how it should have been staged and like go with that, it's.
Yeah, no, Bacchae is, there's a scholar named Charles Siegel who wrote a book called Dionysiac Poetics and Euripides Bacchae, and he talks a lot about the kind of meta-theatrical aspects of Bacchae. And there was a production about 3 or 4 years ago with City Company. Artistic director was Ellen Lauren, who played Dionysus, but Anne Bogart was also involved, who's a very famous theater director. And she said, and I went to a talk with her before the show premiered, and she said that this was one of the most difficult plays for her to direct because there's already a director in the play. And it's Dionysus. And this is a play where Dionysus is the director and the stage manager and the costume designer and the sound designer and the lead actor. And it's a tremendously meta-theatrical play. So it's, because it is a play about performance and identity and saying that you are something and then making it so, which is it gets really, really interesting when you kind of fold that into thinking about gender as performative. And that gets really hairy when you apply it to what happens with Pentheus. And the way that Pentheus's experience of gender is staged. Not necessarily how it is in the Greek, not necessarily how Euripides would have meant it to be, but in the way that it is staged and discussed. Because for audience context, Pentheus is encouraged by Dionysus to dress as a woman, to go up and spy on the maenads, and he is, discovered at the top of a tree, and the tree is uprooted, and he is horribly torn apart by his mother and aunts. But he does so dressed as a woman. Not just a woman, specifically a maenad. He is specifically dressed as one of Dionysus's own followers, and the way that he is coerced into doing this is more often than not on stage played for comedy, and is played as it, and plays off of the tropes in modern media that a man in a dress is automatically funny. Which, no.
Yeah, problematic as hell.
Problematic as hell. And again, like my first experiences of this play in college, 19, I never found those scenes funny. Not because I was consciously thinking about the very like complicated gender dynamics going on in there, but because it was so sad.
It's not written funny.
No, it's really kind of it's sad and it's scary.
Yeah, it's so deceptive. It's so like, it's not at all written funny.
No, and you can see Pentheus kind of fighting it at some turns, and like I'm of the opinion that there's a little bit of Jedi mind trickery going on, that Dionysus is maybe kind of taking a desire that's already there and turning it up to 11.
Oh, interesting,
or taking an inhibition that's there and turning it down. I don't think he's putting ideas in Pentheus's head that aren't there. I don't think he's putting desires in Pentheus that aren't there. But it is so, so sad and scary to watch somebody kind of understanding that their autonomy is being violated and then succumb to it and then go through this experience that maybe in an alternate reality could have been something that was like good and healing and opening up something in Pentheus. And if this is something that would have been helpful for him, or maybe this is something that he wants, if this is something that he genuinely wants, if having any kind of experience of femininity, I don't put any kind of label on it. I do not think that I think that it is up to the translator and up to the choice of the individual production to, if they want to put a name to it, put a name to it. Pentheus is having some kind of experience of femininity and of non-normative gender and is enjoying it. And that could be something that is a positive experience, and particularly a positive experience that is being gifted to them by the god of that.
Which exists a lot in mythology, right? Like that's the story I always go back to, is this idea that a lot of characters that we can see now as trans were gifted with their true gender by the gods. They were transformed. And so often it is, it is a gift or a punishment, but I mean, still you can like it still is a transformation by the gods that, and so that is so interesting. And then, to also look at it as, we can gather that at some point Dionysus went through a similar experience and found that comforting and nice to be, expressing themselves in that way. And then so to do it almost forcefully to Pentheus sort of adds another layer onto that as well.
Yeah, and it's on stage. It is, and I rarely see it staged this way because I understand why you wouldn't, because you want Pentheus's outfit to have some kind of impact. And if you're playing it for comedy, which you shouldn't, you have to make like a very distinct sartorial choice. But if we go with what is in the play, the way that what Dionysus describes himself as wearing at the top of the play and what Pentheus puts on are the same outfit. They are achieving a level of, they are coming towards each other in this way that could be so interesting and so cool and so helpful. And this is happening while Pentheus is having hallucinations and or elements of religious kind of ecstatic experience. He comes back out dressed as the Maenad, and he is seeing double. He sees 2 suns in the sky, 2 sets of 7 gates around the city of Thebes. And those are things that are and are not real, or he's kind of getting a glimpse behind the veil, or he's getting some kind of heightened or altered state of consciousness. And then he looks at Dionysus and he sees bull horns from Dionysus's head. And the bull is a sacred symbol of Dionysus, and Dionysus in Bacchae in particular is very often conflated with the bull, is called a bull when he is leading Pentheus to his death. And Pentheus sees the bull. And it's very hard for me to view this act, the costume change, as something that is just purely deceptive and purely cruel and purely meant to be shameful and humiliating, when it is accompanied by some kind of divine and magical and holy glimpse of truth. It's this very weird combination of elements of like, yes, he's about to die. Yes, this is not for his benefit, but he does get this one little moment of seeing something that both is and is not there, and seeing something that is not real and yet more than real, while he himself is experiencing in his own body something that is not real and more than real. In that, like, my body and the way that I choose to have my body look in the world are different right now. and feel different, and I feel different in them. And he has, he is adjusting the way that he stands. He says, I want to look like my mother right now. Is this how my Aunt Ino stands? I want to get it right. Tell me what to do. Tell me how to exist in this new version of myself, which is for me personally, as a person who, as a queer person, as a non-binary person, holy shit. And it's so sad. It is so sad that something that could be so good is used for such violence. And particularly a queer person inflicting violence through queerness onto another person who could potentially also be queer. And how absolutely heartbreaking that is.
Yeah, I mean, it's, it's meant to be a tragedy, but that certainly adds another level to the tragedy, or it turns the tragedy into not the tragedy that people think they're getting out of the Bacchae, or the way it's been traditionally staged. The tragedy that's traditionally the tragedy in it is not that part. Yeah. But that, I mean, that is a huge part of the tragedy. It is all of the aspects of what is going on in that relationship between those two people in those moments. It's just,
it's really interesting because there's a tendency to stage Pentheus, and I've seen it go down in recent years, and I've seen a lot of people do it in the way that I kind of think that there's more resonance. I think Dionysus and Pentheus are of a very similar age. And there's a tendency to stage Pentheus as a little bit older.
Right. I don't think that in the myth there's any suggestion that Pentheus exists when Dionysus is born.
No, and it gets really hard particularly with like tragedy continuity, because with a play like Bacchae that doesn't exist in a trilogy and doesn't kind of have any ties to other plays in Euripides, you kind of have to, I kind of have to treat it as like a little kind of canon bubble. Because in order for certain things to happen the way that they do in this play, other things that exist in the mythological record can't have happened.
That's very true. Yeah, because I mean, even think of like Cadmus being around is not necessarily true from the larger mythology of these.
Cadmus being around, and also like the myth of Athamas and Ino, because Ino raises, in some versions, raises baby Dionysus and is punished by Hera for that. So there's I kind of have to treat it as like its own little like snow globe of canonical reference. But the way Pentheus is explicitly described in the Greek as young, as a youth, and there's Cadmus has recently abdicated and nominated Pentheus to be king. When Agave is holding his head at the end, she describes him as like a lion cub that has just the first growth of a beard. People talk about him as a youngish man. And I think that creates a very powerful image of these two young, angry people kind of bouncing off of each other. Because there's a real tendency in the scholarship around Bacchae to kind of describe it as this like tidal wave of divinity that just crashes over Pentheus. And Pentheus is completely helpless, and there's nothing he can do, and it is a dark and cynical play about how we are playthings of the gods, and they will do with us what they will, and we can do nothing to stop them. And I think that's a story to be told. That's a really valid story to be told, and I respect that, because I think we've all had a year where we feel like that.
And that is Greek mythology so largely. But yeah, I don't see it in that play necessarily either. No.
Every time that like scholars talk about the scene of like Dionysus convincing Pentheus to go up to the mountain, they call it a seduction.
Oh my god!
And I'm like, no. And also like Dionysus says what they've done. And says, and like kind of like pretty well walks the chorus and the audience through their own thinking, and nowhere says I will seduce this man, and nowhere says like I am going to be like, the way that they're described in the scholarship is like, oh, they're coy, they're inviting, they're enthralling, they're alluring. And I'm like, because what they do say in the Greek, it's kind of, it's very aggressive and violent. They say, you know, I'm going to plant like a whirling madness in his heart. I'm going to, you know, tear his wit. You know, I'm going to send him out of his wits. Like, it's this very forceful language. It's not, I'm going to trick him, I'm going to deceive him, I'm going to seduce him.
Yeah.
And the way that there's this automatic conflation of this otherness, of this queerness with otherness with sexual entrapment, is wrong and bad.
Yeah. That's extra interesting because that, to me, that I immediately go to all of the translations that talk about Hades as seducing Persephone and every god as seducing women. But in those cases, it is a slight on the women, not the seducer. But in the case of Dionysus, this queer character, it is a slight on them instead of a slight on Pentheus. It's like, it's still, the way they managed to do that.
It's still a slight on the non-normative person.
Yes. Today we're visiting that god of it all, that often gender fluid, definitely super bisexual god of wine and partying and good times, except maybe when it came to his boyfriends. Bromius, Briseis, Lucius, Liber, Bacchus, Dionysus. Dionysus is, as we all well know, the most fun-loving and fluid of the gods. He was everything. He played with his gender identity, though I do call him he because that's the only pronoun we really have for him, and he found love with men and women. One of Dionysus's more famous love affairs with a young man is with the satyr named Ampelus. Because in this part of the Dionysiaca, it tells the story of Dionysus and Ampelus in the most detailed way, beginning with a scene where a young Dionysus, just barely out of childhood, is beating the heat of Helios by splashing around in a stream in Lydia, Asia Minor, in the region of the Turkish peninsula. A reminder, too, that Dionysus, among all those other names I said earlier, is also called Bacchus interchangeably. The Dionysiaca, at least in this section, is gorgeous. I've only read bits and pieces of it so far for the podcast, and this section is great and other sections are kind of wild. But the way it describes Dionysus when he meets Ampelus is truly lovely. Dionysus splashes around, swimming in this river with a bunch of satyrs, all enjoying a midday swim to cool off. Quote, "Playful satyrs lifted their heels in air and tumbled, plunging head over into the river. One self-propelled swam with paddling hands prone on the waves and imprinted a footstep on the swell. As he pushed with back-stretching legs and cut the water rolling in riches, one dived deep down to the underwater caves and hunted for speckled fishy prey down below, stretching a groping hand over the swimming fry, left the deeps again and offered to Bacchus the fish purpled with the slime of the opulent river." You all know how I love reading quotes. Basically, what a beautiful day, a beautiful scene between God and satyrs, just splashing around, enjoying the river. It sounds delightful. And that is where Dionysus finally spots the young satyr Ampelus. Dionysus finds Ampelus to be absolutely gorgeous. I like to think they're about the same age, though you never know. We're gonna go with they are. He is just the most beautiful man Dionysus has ever seen, just striking and stunning, and oh my gods, how can anyone be quite so beautiful? These are the thoughts running through Dionysus's mind, and while he pretends that he himself is not a god, at least for now, he starts to flirt with Ampelus. He flatters the man, asking how he could be so beautiful, which gods are his parents, for he must have immortal parents, Dionysus explains, because how else could he possibly have turned out like he has? It's flattery, definitely, and flirty, absolutely, but there's also a sincerity in the way it's described that I think is somewhat unique to Dionysus, at least in the way I see him. He's sincere and often just a nice guy. He has his issues, yes, but ultimately Dionysus just feels to be the least threatening, the most lovely and genuine of the gods. As he continues to make eyes at Ampelus, chatting up the young man, he asks, quote, "What father begat you? What immortal womb brought you forth? Which of the graces gave you birth? What handsome Apollo made you? Tell me, my friend, do not hide your kin. If you come another Eros, unwinged, without arrows, without quiver, which of the blessed slept with Aphrodite and bred you? But indeed I tremble to name Cypris as your mother, for I would not call Hephaestus or Ares your father." Ampelus is, as you might imagine, incredibly taken with Dionysus. Here's this guy, he's gorgeous and flirty and fun and so charming, and he's telling Ampelus that he's just the most beautiful man he's ever seen. The pair hit it off immediately, and before long Dionysus spends every waking moment thinking of Ampelus, and while it's not explicit because this story is more devoted to the actions of the god, I'd like to imagine that Ampelus feels the same. I know I would. Dionysus is so taken with Ampelus that he finds himself distracted by everything else in his life. If music plays in the woods, satyrs beating on drums, but Ampelus isn't around, Dionysus is unmoved by it. If he attempts to play his own instruments, but Ampelus isn't there, he simply can't even get into his own songs. When he's with Ampelus and the man stops speaking to Dionysus, Dionysus becomes immediately sad, bummed out, just missing Ampelus's voice. And worst of all, if Ampelus dances amongst the other satyrs, everyone joining in, Dionysus is full of envy. Now, is this healthy in modern terms? Absolutely not. Is it kind of endearing when you're reading about it in an ancient epic, given it involves two consenting men who we will call adults for these purposes because it's actually a little questionable, but that would just make it too weird? Yes. Well, since we're on this, and like I kind of want to jump around and talk about everything, but you brought up the statues of Aphrodite, and so one of the other things that you kind of suggested we talk about was like trans Aphrodite, and that's something that I have not looked into much, but like I've always kind of known stories of, and so I would love to hear more about these ideas of like a trans Aphrodite.
Yeah, so I love this idea and this concept of like a trans Aphrodite. I think it's one of my favorite kind of interpretations of god or goddess from antiquity. And actually Bettany Hughes wrote in her book Venus and Aphrodite, which is an amazing book. She writes about how the kind of like birth story of Venus or Aphrodite is that you have this Titan, like OG god Uranus, and his son cuts his dick off and throws it into the sea. And then from this cut off dick,
I call it castration foam. That's been my
nice.
I've kind of coined that term.
Yeah, I love that. I love it. From the castration foam, up comes Aphrodite. And so biologically, Aphrodite just is 100% male. There has been no female influence in her creation. She's 100% come out of a dick. And so Bettany Hughes talks about this and says that it could be this early recognition of a non-binary nature of sex and desire, which I think is a really interesting starting point. That she comes out of this kind of mythology in a really interesting way. And then, like I said, it's in Cyprus that you see these kind of sculptures of the goddess in like a traditional female form and dress, but then wearing a really thick beard. And you also, alongside these kind of depictions of the goddess in these sanctuaries across Cyprus, you see these non-binary figures who appear to have been potentially what we would call like transgender priests. So these figures don't fall into a typical category of male or female, and they're all kind of coming together in this worship of Aphrodite in this specific region.
And I'll just say too for the listeners, like Cyprus is also mythologically where she was born, which I think also says a lot about that, like where that castration foam erupted was said to be off the coast of Cyprus.
Exactly. And Aristophanes, this playwright, talks about Aphrodite and says that she was brought to Athens from Cyprus, and that on Cyprus people worshipped Aphrodite, Aphroditos. So that's an Aphrodite in both like female and male form. And that she had these massive like celebrations where people cross-dressed in her honor. Like all the way through in loads of different sources, we find it all coming back to Cyprus, and then there being this kind of fluidity of the kind of gendered appearance and associations with the goddess, which I think is just so, it's just so interesting. As I said before, this guy Macrobius, this Roman writer, who then talked about this again, about this statue of Venus that, had a beard, was dressed as a woman, but then was exposing the fact that she had this dick, and they conceive of her as not just female, but also male. And he lists off a whole bunch of different authors. So also Aristophanes again, and he's this guy Lavius, and Philorcus is another one. And he has them all in a list, basically just like providing more evidence to the fact that, Philorcus also says that men sacrifice to her wearing women's dress and women in men's because she's held to be both male and female. So reading that, there does seem to be this association, and it isn't found all over ancient Greece. Like it seems to be very specifically located to Cyprus. But it's just a really fascinating kind of like mini celebration in the kind of broader scheme of celebrations of this goddess of who's, effectively of, love, beauty, sex. She's like this pinnacle of like, at the time, what it meant to be this desirable woman. And then you get this just really interesting, like kind of focus in on this non-binary approach to, as Bettany Hughes said, this non-binary nature of sex and desire. And that's expressed through sculptures that it looks like what the priests might have worn and identified with, and all of these like worshippers. And it's just a really interesting kind of case study into the fact that ancient history wasn't just cisgender binary, this is male, this is female, but there's just this like massive colourful spectrum of experiences, and it's really cool.
Well, and it makes me think too about the fact that she is tied to the story of Hermaphroditus, which is like this idea of an intersex person, and it feels like, it's interesting that story is sort of, and I don't know the regionality of that. I'm forgetting where. I know a lot of it probably comes from Ovid, but I'm trying to think of like anything earlier sources. But it's interesting that like she has this nature tied to Cyprus, but even in the broader kind of sense, she still has these kind of, you know, fluidity of gender stories, or this story of a person who is just inherently both, you know, biologically, and that's sort of interesting in itself, or like a sort of a connection to like the broader Greek world, having these stories that tie in with Aphrodite, and even the like the eros of it all too, because there's all these different kind of stories about what level of like relation eros has to Aphrodite. Like there's the idea of that kind of primordial eros, but then also the eros that is more directly born, like sometimes it's like he's born alongside her too. Like I feel like Hesiod is the one, or he also talks about the primordial eros, but then he also has this eros that is born like almost with Aphrodite from that foam. And that kind of feels like a similar thing, where it's like we still have these kind of like, unlike the rest of the gods, which kind of have their sort of one-off thing that they're the god of, and there's only one and they're gendered and whatever, like love is the thing. Love and desire and sexuality is the thing that gets, even in the most sort of conservative tellings, you still get a female goddess and a male goddess of those things. And then if you do look into it beyond that, and are looking at it more for that kind of non-binary fluidity nature, like you can sort of see how the two of them kind of act in tandem as this kind of like team, so that there are, you know, there is like a broader spectrum when it comes to really specifically sexuality and love and desire and everything.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that.
Yeah. Do you know, I'm curious, like, especially because of where Cyprus is, like, so far east, you know, there are all these ties with Aphrodite to goddesses of the east. Like, for some reason, Astarte is the only one I can think of right now.
Yeah.
But and like Inanna and Ishtar, do they have those connections to Aphrodite? I'm questioning everything now. But basically, do you know if those Eastern forms that kind of lend themselves to Aphrodite historically, like whether they had any kind of trans nature as well?
Yeah, like they completely do. Like, so we've got like in Phoenicia we have like Astarte, and then like in different areas of the Near East it's Ishtar, and then from Ishtar you can go even further back to ancient Sumeria to Inanna, and I think it's Ishtar, but also it might crop up in some of the worship of Inanna as well. But we have these texts that talk about like how amazing their goddesses are, and they say, and your ability to turn men to women. And there are these things that pop up about different like priests and priestesses, where these ancient goddesses were seen to have the ability to take someone who had, you know, been identified male at birth, and then through the worship of this goddess was then transformed into something else, whether they were then considered to be like a woman, or whether it was just like no longer a man. But yeah, we see this ability in these kind of this Near Eastern goddess worship with Ishtar and Inanna, who it seems like they can transcend the normal like boundaries of gender, and they have the ability to enable their worshippers to kind of transcend this typical binary, which is actually like a big part of when you're looking for evidence of especially kind of like transgender experiences. It often comes through divine intervention. Like it's very much seen like, okay, that's why I think the example with Lucian and Megilla or Megillos is a really interesting example, because that's one of the only ones where there isn't any kind of god involved. But you know, all the way throughout like Ovid's Metamorphoses, with the characters like Iphis and Caeneus and people, they all change gender through the intervention of a god or goddess. And yeah, it's very much seen like this is the ability of the divine to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that's quite an interesting connection, I think, that the divine have. Yeah, that it's seen as something that can be, I wouldn't say necessarily a gift, but it's seen as like to change gender often requires a god involved in these stories, which isn't to say, of course, that like that was the experience of lived people in ancient times, but just with the literature that we see, a lot of the literature attributes that to the gods being above nature and above the kind of limits of people and culture and all of this kind of thing. The gods act outside of that, and so they can change things that people might not be able to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always kind of seen it through those stories specifically, and I do think mostly of the same ones you mentioned, like Iphis and Canis, but like the idea, I mean, Canis is a little bit different and weird because there's like a trauma involved.
Yeah.
But Iphis is a good example where it's almost like the god was just kind of able to give them like what they wanted, and sort of like fix what was seen as a problem. And it's kind of nice, it's kind of like it's almost, and it's impossible to say what people's lived experiences were, like you said, but it's kind of nice to imagine that it was seen like that, where we're like a person who, felt like they were born in the wrong body, could have this example of like, oh, well, like at least somebody like me got changed by the god to be who they felt that they were, or things like that. It's kind of like, it's just kind of nice, Nerds, thank you as always for listening. I really love doing these moments, particularly when it comes to Pride Month, because I really can't bring myself to let go this desire to share these stories from the ancient world. But of course, I have now covered them all. But I really love being able to pick out just these little pieces to remind you all, because I mean, let's be honest, I release so many episodes. It's easy for these things to get lost, and then re-listening to them, you're like, okay, that's really relatable or really true or just generally really entertaining. So I'm happy to share them with you again. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians, my assistant producer. Laura Smith is the production assistant and audio engineer. Select music in this episode was by Luke Chaos. The show is part of the iHeart Podcast Network. Listen on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. I am Liv, and I love this shit.